for everything in one location. Daily news, reviews, interviews, podcasts, video, and social media feeds. Bookmark FanthaTracks.com for Star Wars news 24/7, 365.
Weirding Way Media.
Welcome to episode 107 of the Filmumentries podcast. This is your host, Jamie Benning, talking to you from my home here in London, England. We just got back from a big family holiday, one that we've been saving for about 3 years now. So, my older girls finished their school exams at the same time. So we felt like it was a good reason to mark that moment in their lives. And we had a wonderful time for 2 whole weeks, our longest holiday ever. And now we're back to the reality of home life with some, quite frankly, deeply upsetting things happening on the streets in the UK. I'm not going to get into that, but, if you agree with any of these thugs, just stop listening and go and educate yourself. Talk to some people, read some books. Moving on, for this episode, the first of 3 in August 2024. 3 because in July you only got 1 of the usual 2 episodes, due to me being away with my family, as I said earlier. For the first of these 3 episodes, you'll hear my interview with the owner of Rancho Obi-Wan, former Lucasfilm fan relations officer, author, and all-round nice guy, Steve Sansweet. I met Steve when I visited Rancho Obi-Wan back in April during my epic visit to California. I still can't believe all of that happened, really. We chatted briefly when I was there, and I asked him if he would consider coming on the podcast. So in June, I had the chance to chat with him. As a reminder, I put out on social media that I was going to chat with Steve and gave you the opportunity to post a question. So look out for that about kind of towards the end, about 85% into the conversation. So here's my conversation with Steve Sansweet, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. Steve, thanks for joining me. When did the passion for movies, was there a passion for movies when you were a kid? Did you grow up as one of those kids that was always going to the theater?
I went to the theater. There was a theater in the neighborhood, and we could go to see the Saturday matinees for 25 cents. Bargain. And so I would go frequently with my friends from the neighborhood and go see movies. But the first movie I remember, there are 2 movies I remember. There was something called The Boy with the Green Hair. I remember nothing about it except I was fascinated that someone would have green hair. Of course, these days, it's very easy to have green hair and walk around in public. But the first movie I remember was a horror movie, a classic horror movie that my dad took me to when I was 10 years old. It was Them. The giant ants, the radioactive ants that attacked Los Angeles. And I remember that's, in retrospect, a strange movie to take a 10-year-old to. Yeah. I'm sure I had seen other movies before that, but that just really made an impression. And then I was very lucky when I was at the Wall Street Journal in Los Angeles. There were frequent media passes for new movies. And so a couple times a week, I would get passes to see these new productions. And so I loved going to the movies. I had a joint passion for science fiction growing up, reading science fiction novels, and the space program, the real space program. I used to cut articles out of the newspapers. Remember newspapers?
Yeah.
There were things that you actually read that you held in your hand. My. But, so so the science fiction aspect and the real life space program sort of merged in my passions. And I started collecting science fiction toys and robots, and some of the wonderful Japanese metal robots, and then the plastic robots, the battery operated, from starting in the 50s and 60s and 70s. There was a frustration, though, because when I would go to the toy store, the toy shows, the robots that I really wanted, the classic robots, were always slightly out of my price range. Whatever my price range was, they were a couple $100 more. And it was the advertising executives and the dentists and the doctors who were buying these things up. And then Star Wars came out. It changed my life. To think that a movie could change your life and the direction of your life is pretty amazing in retrospect, but it certainly did.
It's amazing, isn't it? It affected so many people. But back when you were a 6-year-old, it was the passion for writing that you had initially. Is that right? That's what led to the Wall Street Journal?
Yeah, one of my aunts was a good writer, and she encouraged me, and I started at the Hobart Street News, a hand-lettered pencil news. I don't even know what to call it. It wasn't a newspaper. It was a news pad, maybe, on a piece of paper that I would try to sell to the neighbors for 3 to 5 cents. And I remember my next door neighbor said, "I'm not paying for that. That's too expensive."
What did it contain? What was it, like local news and gossip and things like that?
Yeah, things about the local pets and what people were doing and things of that nature. There were only 3 or 4 issues. I gave up in frustration. But I had a passion for writing, and so in junior high school, I worked for the school newspaper. High school, I worked for the school paper and the yearbook. And in college, I became editor of our daily 4-day-a-week newspaper, printed newspaper. This was way before online, way before the internet. So I was editor for a year, and went from that to working on a summer job for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I was a police beat reporter, a fill-in police beat reporter, and got my first byline, and that was magic. Seeing my name in print over a story, however gory it was, and then went to the Inquirer full-time, and then I was in the Air Force Reserve and Air National Guard for 6 years off and on, but 6 months of active duty.
Right.
That was the Vietnam era.
Right.
So I was fortunate to get into the Guard and not having to join the regular armed forces.
Yeah.
And there was a problem at the Inquirer. One of the top investigative reporters turned out to be a guy who was stealing the clippings from the newspaper's library and selling them to bad guys. So if you had another problem in your record, and the reporter called for the clips to see what the past deeds were, they couldn't find anything, so they didn't know about your past record. It was just bizarre. And there was a huge shakeup, and everybody was angry, and the guy who had hired me was sort of blamed for the thing, although he had nothing to do with it. And I heard of an opening at the Wall Street Journal. Now, I was not a business reporter, had no interest in business, but I loved the front page stories that they did. And I heard that they gave you sometimes days, weeks, months to work on one of these front page stories back in the day. And so I went to the Philadelphia office of the Wall Street Journal. I was hired, eventually transferred to Montreal for 2.5 years, and then out to Los Angeles. So I was in LA and with the Wall Street Journal for 26 years. And it's there that I encountered Star Wars.
Yeah. What year did you join the Wall Street Journal then?
1969.
Okay. So you had a good 8 years before Star Wars arrived. And when that film arrived, I've spoken to so many people that have worked on the films and have been inspired by the films. How did it hit you? What was your reaction to seeing that movie for the first time? Were you aware of the buzz beforehand, being a collector of sci-fi and interested in sci-fi?
Well, I was. There was a publication called Media Scene that had done a front page story. It was a tabloid newspaper sized publication. And so I gobbled that up. That came out either in late 76 or early 77. And then my first collectible really was a brochure, a marketing brochure that Lucasfilm and 20th Century Fox sent out to theater owners and managers to try to get them to book the movie in the theater. And they also sent it out to the media. And the guy who covered Hollywood for the Journal in the LA office looked at it, and I saw him looking at it. I was sort of panting a little. And then he threw it away in his trash can. I waited till he left for the day, sort of traipsed over to the trash can, and it was my first dumpster diving for Star Wars, but by far not the last. So I had seen all these wonderful photos and some sketches and paintings and things of that nature, and then got the invitation to a screening at the back lot of 20th Century Fox in the Darrell F. Zanuck Theater 10 days before Star Wars opened to the general public.
Wow.
So it was before all the hype had started. And I remember sitting in the theater and like almost everybody, all these hard-bitten news people, and the Star Destroyer goes overhead and we're all looking up saying, where did that come from? And sort of laughing to ourselves. And I was hooked immediately.
Amazing to be there before the phenomenon hit and already feeling its impact on you as an individual rather than this sort of collective impact.
Yeah, it just spoke to me. I mean, the visual effects, the fun story, I identified at least initially with Luke Skywalker. Here he was yearning to leave his backward homestead on a backward planet and going out and finding adventure or finding what his journey in life was. And I remember I was raised and grew up in Philadelphia, which has turned into a much nicer city than I was when I was growing up. But I remember thinking all my friends and my schoolmates were staying in Philadelphia for the most part, but I had this urge to leave and find what my true destiny would be. Little did I know what it would turn out to be.
Yeah. Amazing to be there, though, at the time. I mean, this is the thing that is difficult for people of a certain age to not really consider the landscape of movies being released at the time. I mean, it was if it was dropped out of space, this movie. There was nothing like it. I mean, that imagery, you go through some of those early magazines like Photoplay and some of those early publications that had images from the movie, and you look at the other films that were talked about at the time, there was absolutely nothing like it. It was completely individual. Yeah. And great that it, spoke to so many people, you included, and that set you on this journey that you're still on in many ways. I mean, many of us are on that journey thanks to Star Wars in some shape or form. So that was your first collectible in the trash can.
From the trash can.
When did the collection begin itself? What was next? And because obviously there wasn't much around at the time when it first came out.
No, well, I was still buying the rockets and robots, and I had built up a pretty good space collection by the time Star Wars came out, and I still collected some of that stuff. In fact, about 40 of my Star Trek toys were borrowed by the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum for an exhibition in 1990. And as a result of that, I had talked to the curator, who became a bit of a friend. And I said, well, what you should really do is a Star Wars exhibit. She said, well, we'd love to, but we can't get a hold of anybody at Lucasfilm to talk to about that. And I said, well, let me try. Because by then I had started working on my first book for Star Wars. And so that led to the first major Star Wars traveling exhibit, The Magic of Myth, and a book that was written by the curator. But going back to what the initial collectibles were, there was not much stuff out there except for cardboard puzzles, a board game. And I can remember my first three-dimensional item was something from a semi-schlocky gift store chain that was on the cash register stand, and there were these necklaces that had little silver Chewbacca's, R2D2s, 3POs, and they had moving arms on them. So that was my first movable Star Wars collector's item.
And were you around for the early bird kit and all of that?
Actually, I never saw the early bird kit until after it expired. And so I bought one in January of that year, too late to, and I told the store, well, this expired, so would you give it to me at a discount? And they refused to, but I still bought two of them. I opened one and kept one sealed. But I managed to get an early bird kit. I traded somebody for one back in the day when people were selling and trading Star Wars collectibles for nothing approaching what they're selling them for today.
Yeah. I think the first time I became aware of them being collectible, it must have been 1983. I was on the south coast here in England in a town called Brighton, and I didn't have a Jawa, and I wanted one for my collection. And the guy in the toy store there said, "Oh, you'd be lucky to find one of those. They're real collector's items." And I'd never heard that phrase before. And whether he was talking about the cloth cape or the vinyl cape, who knows? But it really struck me at that point that, oh, wow, people collect these things. They're not actually just buying them to play with or whatever. Because, I was one when Star Wars came out. I was 1 year old. So I don't remember a world without it.
Been lying about all these dates.
But that collection, then, you were kind of in a sweet spot in many ways, because when we reached kind of 1985, I remember thinking I'd grown out of Star Wars and some of my toys were passed on to friends and cousins and things. But really, I wanted those Power of the Force figures and I wanted all that stuff, But at that time, there were action figures going for the equivalent of $1. Bundles of them going for a couple of dollars here. I mean, that must have been
in the US.
Were you buying that stuff up?
I was buying some of that stuff up. I got from a collector friend in the UK. Or in France, I can't remember which one I got these from, but I got about 20 Yak Face figures, and they cost me. And these were ones that were not distributed in the US at all, only on the Tri-Logo card and then on the Canadian card with the coin. And I can remember buying them for like $2, $2.50 a piece, shipped. I thought I was making a profit. I doubled my money by selling them to another friend for $5.
Amazing.
Yeah. So, I mean, we weren't thinking back then in terms of, some people were.
Yeah.
But what really became my crossing the Rubicon, I guess, was in the late 80s. When, as you said, Star Wars was sort of out of fashion. There were very few, if any, new items for sale. And I came across 3 collectors, all of them back east in the United States, who were getting divorced. And they had to monetize their collections for the divorce settlement. Yeah. And so I bought chunks of these 3 collections, one of which was the largest collection at the time. And I got the bulk of what became the start of my major poster collection. I now have over 3,000 posters, but from this one purchase and some other very interesting items. If I knew what I know now, I would have bought a lot more. But it was that sort of impetus. And then a couple of years later, I heard via third party, and then went to the second party and found out that the first party was selling some models that had been made by Industrial Light and Magic as gifts for friends of Gary Kurtz, the producer of the first 2 Star Wars movies. And while Gary was back in the UK, these had been in storage in Los Angeles, and he invited me over to his house, and I looked at 10 or 11 incredible models that had been made. I said, let me think about it. He told me what the prices would be for the individuals. And I thought about it that night, didn't get much sleep. Called him the next day and I said, well, I've made my decision. And he said, well, which one do you want? And I said, all of them. And that was the first time I got a second mortgage on my house. So that's how serious I was.
Wow. And what were those models of?
Well, there was a production size snow speeder. There's a Millennium Falcon. So some of these were from model kits that had been produced after the fact, but they were assembled and hand painted by the ILM experts. So they could have been used as secondary models, tertiary models in some of the scenes where there were a lot of spacecraft. So over the years, I've sold some of those and I've traded with some of those. It's part of collecting. You don't get to keep everything that you once had. I love the behind the scenes kind of objects, so I have more of those than I do of the actual models that I bought from the Gary Kurtz collection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is something about collecting, and I think particularly with Star Wars, it's something about getting closer to those movies that we love, isn't it? You want to kind of reach out and touch those things. And like you said, whether it's something that was behind the scenes or something that was in front of the camera, there is something about just wanting to get closer to those movies. But you've managed to leap over that chasm and actually influence the path of the future movies with your role at Lucasfilm. How did that role first come about, Steve? What were the circumstances around that?
Well, I had been bureau chief at the Journal in Los Angeles for 9 years. The normal period of time for a bureau chief was 3, 4 maximum. And so I was clogging up the system, and it was necessary to give somebody else a chance, but I didn't want to leave that role. They offered me 3 other possible assignments, going back to New York as an editor, starting up a local edition of the Wall Street Journal, which I didn't have much faith in, or becoming a super reporter at the same salary. And then I got a call from Lucasfilm out of the blue from the head of public relations. And she said, Steve, I wonder if, and at that point I had written a number of books. I had spent some time at Skywalker Ranch that got to know the people there.
And so those, sorry, just to interrupt. So those books would have been from concept to screen to collectible.
The first one came out concept to screen to collectible. I had heard that Lucasfilm was considering doing a price guide, and I called the head of PR, who I knew because I had done a phone interview with George Lucas in 1987 for the 10th anniversary of Star Wars, and I desperately wanted to visit Skywalker Ranch. So I said, I'd be happy to fly up. She said, no, we'll do it on the phone. And I said, no, we'll do it on the phone. And so George gave me a half an hour to interview him. And I wrote this op-ed piece on the 10th anniversary of Star Wars. And I remember one of the things was that the Fox board of directors, at least several of them, didn't have much faith in Star Wars. They didn't like the title, first of all, because originally it was called The Star Wars. They thought it was like Elizabeth Taylor being angry at Rock Hudson or, Star Wars, whatever. And that provoked a letter to the editor from one of the former directors saying, we knew what we had on our hands, which was complete BS. But anyway, I had talked to the head of publishing and said, I heard you're doing a price guide, and I think if anybody does it, it should be me. And she said, and you are who? And we talked for a while, and she said, what I really want is a price guide with anecdotes. And I said, you can't do a price guide with anecdotes. You can do a book with anecdotes or a price guide. And that led to doing From Concept to Screen to Collectible, the book with the most awkward title that I have ever written. And
what a cover, Steve! I saw that in I tell you, at that point, that was the dark times almost of Star Wars. I think the Zahn novels maybe had come out, but my friend and I were kind of chatting about our toys that we used to have, and he said, "Oh, I've still got my Star Wars toys." And then his brother walked in, his older brother, said, "What are you boys doing?" And we said, "Oh, we're just looking at these Star Wars toys." He said, "Oh, they're collectibles now. I've just seen a book in this comic shop in town," and we went straight there and we bought that book, and that's what kind of set me back on my love of Star Wars. Honestly, that book did. Yeah.
A lot of people say, or thank me or blame me for that book.
Well, both, yeah.
But it was a book that took Star Wars from the idea in George's mind to how it was translated to film, and then how that became marketed as a toy line. Really, the first successful um, toy line for a movie. There had been successful toy lines for television series because that would be on every week for back then 28 weeks or 36 weeks in your home. Movies would come and go by the time that they, unlike today when toys for movies show up 4 to 6 weeks before the movie appears.
Yeah.
Back then they would wait to see how well the movie did and then produce the toys, and it could be a year later that the toys would come out and people would have forgotten the movie, and so that was one of the problems. But it started a whole new way of marketing and merchandising. Some of the early licenses were to help promote the film, like the Marvel Comics, the six issues of Marvel Comics, the novelization, which came out in November of '76 and sold out 500,000 copies in paperback. So there were things out there, but not the toys. In fact, the contract with Kenner Products was signed only a month before the movie came out in May of 1977.
Yeah,
so
crazy.
It really changed the dynamics of the movie business and movie marketing and merchandising. And there was a guy named Charlie Lippincott who was the head of that, who was the guy who really figured out how to do it and how to market it to fans.
Yeah. Be fascinating to see more of his archive. I know his wife is kind of still trying to wrangle a lot of that stuff at the moment to get it out to the public. But fast forward then to the 90s when you're talking about this price guide. Is that what ultimately became the Tomart price guide?
Yeah, I worked with Tom Tumbush and his son Tom N. Tumbush, and we did two versions of the price guide and then a high-end edition of the price guide with an insert of toys that were never produced. I remember that I spent one day in Cincinnati at their headquarters. Tom and I personally signed 2,000 covers of the book for QVC. So that was another claim to fame. I did 5 years of QVC Star Wars Collectibles show from the mid-90s to 1999 when everybody was selling Episode 1 products. So there was nothing too exclusive for QVC.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about it. Was there any reluctance on your part to release this price guide, given that this, part of collecting is that kind of hunt, isn't it? Is looking for that item and maybe not necessarily the buyer doesn't necessarily know the value. Not that you're going to be dishonest to them, but there is that thrill of finding something and getting it for a good price. But here you're publishing something that's saying this thing is worth X $100 or $1,000.
The way I looked at the price guide and conceived of the price guide, it was more of a list of what was available that I knew of, rather than this is what you should pay for something. So we made it very clear that these are prices as of a certain date, and these things fluctuate, and it's willing buyer, willing seller, and that the main function of the price guide, in my view at least, was to show people what they could buy, what they could look for, what they could hunt out. And of course, this was still a few years before we get something like eBay and the internet and the availability to start searching for things online. And so it was an early way of looking at Star Wars. There had been something called the official price guide that wasn't really official, it wasn't Lucasfilm, that had come out from some dealers a couple of years before that. And the Tomart guide was important for its time, which was that sweet spot right before, I think eBay took off in 97, 98. So the price guides came out in the period of 94, 95. And I think were a valuable resource for the time.
Yeah, definitely. I remember looking through that, just going, "Wow!" I mean, I would buy anything with the logo on it back then, and I just remember going through that and thinking, "Wow!" There were things that were only available in certain countries. Like my world kind of opened up. It almost stopped me collecting at that point. I'll be honest, because I realized I didn't have the funds to complete it, and that's when people start going and focusing on collections. Where do you see your sort of boundaries of what to focus on? Because I've been to the Rancho Obi-Wan. I was there in April and met you briefly, and it's incredible. It's absolutely incredible, the collection you've got there. Was there ever a point where you thought, I have to set boundaries here, maybe I need to just focus on this one thing, or is it just a matter of anything that takes your fancy?
I should have set boundaries. Let's put it that way. Um, I and a couple of my friends considered ourselves completists.
Mm,
And what that now means is that we like almost everything, well, we certainly can't find almost everything. My friend Duncan Jenkins, who lives in the Midwest, is a major collector, and so we both consider ourselves completists, and we've tried to help each other. But
mm,
he has a wonderful collection of international items, so some of the same items that were released in the U.S. but in foreign packaging. There's so much out there that even Lucasfilm doesn't have a complete inventory or a complete list
mm.
of everything that was made for Star Wars internationally, and now with Disney and its worldwide licensing, and specific offices in major countries all over the world. It's just an impossible task to be able to find everything. There are high-end items. There are now $5,500 bejeweled purses in the shape of R2D2 Swarovski crystal purses, um, Yadro ceramic pieces, porcelain pieces for $2,000-3,000, replica maquettes.
Yeah.
Regal Robot, one of my favorite new product lines.
Yeah, Tom keeps
Uh,
releasing those busts. I mean, that's that collection's growing. Those
yeah,
maquettes. Yeah.
and I can't resist those. But I have cut way back since I retired from Lucasfilm and started running Rancho Obi-Wan with my good friend Ann Newman, who is the president and chief executive officer now. I've really focused on things that, as you said, tickle your fancy,
Mm,
and items that I think fill a gap. Um, Trying to get some items at least from the new series, because kids who come here say, would you have something from Rebels? You know, so we try to have something from all of the current series.
yeah, yeah. Let's rewind then, just back. We were making that connection between creating those books, and taking this job at Lucasfilm. How did that come about exactly?
So I was working on the first full Star Wars encyclopedia at the
Mm,
time while working full time at the Wall Street Journal. And it was coming along very slowly. I mean, there had been hundreds of books, comics, things like that. I had to read them all to know because it was before things were, I mean, things were always canon and non canon, but it was
mm,
before the whole legends came about. And so I was desperate to find some extra time. Meanwhile, things were happening at the Wall Street Journal. And Lynn Hale called and said, do you know of anybody who might be interested in taking a guaranteed 1 year only job to go out and talk to fans at fan conventions about the special editions? So the call came in 1995.
yeah.
And they had been working on the special editions. At first, it was just going to be Star Wars, and then George decided to do all three movies and make some changes. And I said, let's talk. And one thing led to another. And I figured that if I could, they said, if we could do 8 to 10 conventions. I ended up doing about 35 or 40 that year,
Wow.
that next year, going all across the U.S. I did some international conventions, and the whole idea was to use clips to promote the special editions, and I also did some other promotional activities. So it was quite a change for me, but I would leave on a Friday to go to the event, come back on a Sunday or a Monday, and work on the encyclopedia the rest of the time. So I finally got the encyclopedia finished. And then I was still working out of my house in Los Angeles. And they had just at the end of the year, the beginning of the next year, they restarted the marketing department, which had been in abeyance for many years. And they forgot to get rid of me for 15 years.
Because that was the time when like Star Wars Galaxy and Star Wars Insider magazines were kind of coming out and teasing that the special edition was on the way. That was an exciting time for a Star Wars fan.
Right, and I was writing monthly columns for both publications on collectibles, answering questions, and writing other kinds of stories about what was out there and what had been out there. And meanwhile, trying to keep up with my own collection. And then the avalanche from episode 1 came in 1999. Oh, my goodness.
That was an avalanche. I mean, just in terms of merchandise, it was an avalanche. Have you got a favorite piece from the Phantom Menace era, 99?
And my favorite piece is the tackiest piece in the entire collection, the Jar Jar Binks tongue lollipop, where you push the switch in the back and the candy tongue comes out of Jar Jar Binks' mouth, which opens up, which I always thought was the tackiest thing. I remember going into the office of the head of licensing and said, "How could you make such an item?" And he said, "Kids love gross candy." So
it's true. It's true. I don't know if it was yours, Steve, but I saw that in a cabinet at Lucasfilm at the Presidio in April. There was like a box of it with a few of them on
we
display.
lent them the tongue.
Yeah, right.
Because we had some tongues replaced with acrylic tongues.
Right.
So we had somebody make some tongues for us.
Yeah. So that role that you had there that was supposed to last a year and went on for more than a decade, it evolved over time, right? Things got bigger and bigger in the Star Wars world. How important was it for you to always kind of have this presence? You became the kind of face of Star Wars fandom. You were on the ground with the fans. You were at the conventions. Was Star Wars Celebration, that would have been Colorado 99, wouldn't it?
1999. Dan Madsen and I worked on that. So my boss at the time, the head of marketing, Jim Ward, said as part of the approach to episode 1, we really want to get the fans involved. How about doing some sort of a fan convention? What ideas can you come up with? And he initially said, well, maybe we could do a fan convention in 5 major cities. Every weekend we just move along whatever we have. And I said, that's a little impractical, Jim.
Yeah.
He said, well, how about we do it in 5 cities on the same weekend? I said, that's even more impractical. So I gave Dan Madsen a call, and Dan had already been thinking of the same thing. Dan was the head of Fantastic Media, which published The Insider and had a merchandise catalog, the Jawa Trader. Yes. And I was getting buying a lot of stuff from Dan and from the Jawa Trader. We had an ongoing deal going. And Dan said, well, we've been discussing that here. Let's get together and work on that together. And so we agreed to license it to Dan. And it was at Dan had to come up with the revenue for it. But we looked, where are we going to have it? And he said, well, we really need to have it in the Denver area because we have 100 people on the staff and we need people on the ground in advance working on this thing and being able to carry it out. And so we came up, the convention center had already been booked because here we are 9 months out, I guess. And Dan said, well, the only place that we can have it is the Air and Space Museum, the wings over the Rockies. And this had been a former Air Force base that had been abandoned and was being torn down. There were still the buildings that were still up, but the Wings Over the Rocky Museum would have been a good place for the exhibits. Limited capacity. And when I flew out there with my boss, and we looked at some of the other buildings that they were considering using for venues for stages and things of that nature. They were all in really sad shape. And then we came up with the idea of using giant tents. No one was able to predict that this would be the weekend of 100-year rains in Denver. And the tents, which would have worked under normal circumstances, started to leak.
Sounds like a start of a George Lucas movie making experience, doesn't it? Tunisia, a couple of times he had that happen.
Indeed. So it became our mud stock. But people who were there still loved it. And it was a great opportunity working together with the fan club. And it started our celebrations. And so it just became the kind of thing where, even though the fan club didn't do it for 2 and 3, we knew that we needed to do it because it had been a public relations success, even though we almost canceled it because 10 days before the celebration, the Columbine shootings had happened 10 miles away from the site.
Wow.
And Lucasfilm was of a mind, the president of Lucasfilm at the time wanted to cancel it. And Dan, to his credit, got the mayor of Denver on a call to the Lucasfilm executives who had been meeting all day. And the mayor said, "We really need this. So please do not cancel it." And the president of the company left it in the hands of my boss, who said he was going to sleep on it. Came in the next day and was walking up to his office, and he had this poker face. And I said, "What did you decide?" And he said, "I'll tell you." I mean, he kept the poker face, and I was dying inside. And we got into his office, and he said, I may regret this big time, but we're going to go ahead with it." And as it was, we raised several $1,000s for the families of the Columbine victims. And we had a moment of silence for them. And one of the kids who was killed was a huge Star Wars fan, and so we did something in his memory too.
Oh wow!
So it worked out. It worked out fine.
That's great. That's really great. And then it grew from there. I mean, I went to the one in London last year, was it? And I was in the very fortunate position that I was invited there by Lucasfilm to do a panel. So I was able, with my posh guest pass, to look, stand above and watch the sea of people. I mean, it's incredible how that convention has grown over the years. It was colossal.
Yeah, it's. I'm not sure the XL is the best venue because of the way that it's arranged, with the large hall in the middle and then the squeezed rooms on both sides. But I've been to 2 of the celebrations at the XL, and I had one in Germany and one in Japan. Of course, we're going back to Japan next year. Mm-hmm. So it's been the kind of thing where the fans, I mean, it's not only the exclusive merchandise, although that does very well. The panels get very well attended. There are great announcements. But what became very obvious at the beginning was it was the opportunity to meet and come back and reconnect with fans from all over the world that you had met and become friends with just in that 3 or 4 day period. And it's really a social gathering more than anything, more than most conventions are. Because it's very specific on Star Wars, and it's all Star Wars all the time.
Yeah. And there's enough of Star Wars for just about everyone these days. You talked about announcements. Go on, sorry.
The Star Wars has so many entry points. I mean, whether it's the original movies that you love, all the movies, all the TV series, the books, the comics, the toys, the cosplaying, you name it. There are all kinds of entries for all age groups, too. I mean, now we have 3 generations going on the 4th generation of fans who have come into Star Wars at all these other points, and have parents or grandparents who they've seen their love for Star Wars and their passion for Star Wars and have adopted that.
Yeah. I saw like a guy dressed as the emperor who didn't need makeup. He was that old, and he had his granddaughter with him dressed as like a tiny Princess Leia. It was great. You mentioned the word announcements there, and it just reminded me you had that opportunity at one of the conventions to announce. Didn't you announce the title of a certain
That
movie?
was the best. That was my favorite, one of my favorite times at Lucasfilm. So this was at San Diego Comic-Con, which is a convention that attracts 150,000 people. It was in their new big Hall H, which seats 5,000 to 6,000 people, and it was packed. And I was doing yearly presentations at Comic-Con, and it was always, what are we going to come up with? We've got to make some sort of announcement, something that's really going to excite the fans. And so that's when my boss, Jim Ward, said, we're going to let you give the title for the episode 3. And of course, Star Wars titles, for people who aren't fans and don't realize it, that has become a major thing in the minds of dyed-in-the-wool Star Wars fans, because it gives you some hint, or lets you start speculating as to what the movie is going to be about and what path it's going to take. And so I figured, well, there's got to be some way to tease this. So I did a double tease. One of them was, we did a video and we did some scenes of episode 1, or we started with 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, and we showed some scenes from the movie. And at the top of the screen, it said episode 4, scenes of A New Hope, and then A New Hope, going through with the episode number and then some scenes and then the title. And so by then people were getting the idea without me saying anything. And we did episode 3, and we had some behind the scenes film taken from the set. And then we were about to spin the title, and instead it went backwards deliberately. And then it came up, and I was wearing an overshirt, and I walked to the front of the podium and opened my shirt, and I was wearing a T-shirt with the Revenge of the Sith logo. And I said, and by the way, these are now available at the Star Wars Pavilion on the main floor.
Everybody's
So, first of all, there was a huge cheer in the audience when the title was shown on the screen. And then once I revealed the T-shirt, there was this mass exodus. People were running for the Star Wars Pavilion. And the Comic-Con people said afterwards, I wish you would have given us a clue. We would have had more security there. People were running and knocking people down, and it was mass pandemonium. But it was great fun, and it was a wonderful panel. And so on the panel, I had Rick McCallum and Hayden Christensen, and we had Carrie Fisher there to talk about some of the past movies.
Wow.
So it was an extraordinary experience.
Yeah, to go from somebody who saw that movie all those years ago, then you get a job there, then you get to reveal the title of a movie. I mean, you're right there in the middle of where every fan wants to be. Talking of fans, Steve, I because you were part of Face Off Fans and Fan Relations, I put out to my followers on social media that they should be asking some questions, right? So if you don't mind, a few people have responded, and I'd like to ask a question. One of them I've actually already asked, David Griffiths. He asked, with it being the 25th anniversary of The Phantom Menace, do you have a favorite piece? We now know it was the Jar Jar lollipop thing, the gross candy.
There's something about that. You just, once you see it and play with it, you can't get it out of your mind.
DJ says, does Steve want his old job back? I look forward to hearing the interview.
I love doing my job. I left it in 2011. I came back for a year of consulting in 2017. It's in very good hands now at Lucasfilm. They've got a good staff that does fan relations. There are people who do publicity who also answer fan letters. And there are people who help to run Celebration and other events. So they've really built it up. I followed in the footsteps of Charlie Lippincott and Craig Miller, who was the first head of the fan club, and they really established some great parameters. And Lucasfilm, to its credit, has always been in touch with the fans from the very beginning, setting up the fan club newsletter, which became Bantha Tracks, and answering fan mail. And they still answer fan mail, which mostly comes as emails these days, but every one of these is answered at some point. So, and letters to George, at least when George was operating the company, were always answered. So,
wish I'd known that. Gaz M, or Menzies Gary, as he's called, says, when concept to screen to collectible came out, having a complete collection of figures seemed doable. How does it feel now that we have thousands of carded figures to hunt down?
Impossible.
Yeah.
The problem is just figuring out what figures are out there and what variations there may be and what cards the same figure have been released on, and do you count that as a new figure? When I was doing the complete action figure collection book with Ann Newman, Ann had to open duplicate 1900 action figures, pulling them off the card and taking photographs of them. I was working with a couple of other folks on that book, and it was still difficult to figure out how many clone troopers are there. Do you count the clone trooper with the bullet, the laser hit here, one on the right leg, one on the left leg? There are 4 different figures for Build Your Army. Right. And then we got into somewhat of a little dispute with the publisher. At the last minute, they said, "Where's Jabba the Hutt?" Well, he's not an action figure. Oh, yes, he is. So what's an action figure?
Yeah, the book's getting bigger and bigger as you go through. Yeah,
the book changed a lot. At a certain point, we were sort of locked in. And if you're adding or subtracting one figure because of the template of the book, it would take you maybe 40 or 50 pages to things would be like dominoes, knocking down and changing everything as you go along. So it was a fraught endeavor near the end, but we got it done. So I think that's the end of my book writing for Star Wars.
Yeah, right.
17 books are plenty.
That is a lot. David Ailing asks, in the ever-expanding nature of Star Wars, have you ever found yourself having to draw a line? We kind of talked about that. Okay, I'm not going to collect things from the new incarnation simply in order to keep Rancho from growing to the size of Skywalker Ranch.
Well, we do have a size problem. Rancho Obi-Wan is about 9,000 square feet. We have an off-site warehouse that's about 7,000 square feet, which is also full and getting fuller. And as I said, I'm not buying as much, but we get donations from fans and from other sources. So we rarely turn anything down. If we have it already in the collection, then it becomes something that we can use as a fundraiser. We also sell memberships to Rancho Obi-Wan. We have fundraisers. We haven't had a gala since 2018, but I think it's safe to say that we're working on something special. So you can sign up for our mailing list. You can go to ranchoobiwan.org. You can become a member. You can book a visit. We do tours on Saturdays. We have our tour schedule 6 months out. And you can sign up for the mailing list without even having to pay for a membership. The membership comes with an annual patch, a pin on your second year, and a letter from me.
Nice. And I can recommend the tour. It's great. I had a great time that day. It was, yeah. I mean, I'd been to the ranch on the Thursday, to Lucasfilm at the Presidio on the Friday, and to Rancho Obi-Wan on the Saturday. I think that's like the trilogy in my head complete.
That's the trifecta, as they say in horse racing.
Yeah, yeah. Gregor Wildman says, I'd love to know if Steve has an idea for a piece of merchandise that was never produced. Is there one that you wish was made?
For a long time, I said, I really want the holographic chess pieces to be made. And then Tom Spina took charge of that, and they produced the wonderful replicas of the holographic chess pieces from Real Robot. Well, I had already gotten a guy in the Midwest that sculpted 10 of the figures and had done such a great job. They were very similar to the replicas. So I didn't buy the replicas at that time. But I finally have the holographic chess pieces. There is so much out there that has been made. I can't hardly think of anything that has not been made, any kind of product. Um, Walmart in Mexico, for a short period of time, carried an unlicensed but cartoon figures on the packaging of women's personal products.
I mean, that is, it's covered all bases.
You can imagine if they can produce something like that with little cartoon Leia figures on them, that just about anything is fair game.
Yeah.
Either way, they're unlicensed.
Shame they didn't continue the collection of the C-3PO sellotape dispenser, like with other characters. That would have been good.
Anthony Daniels is not too pleased with that. Has never been too pleased with that.
It's a good piece. First time I saw it, of course, was in your book. Ian Lowson asks, what's the object in your collection that is the dearest to your heart?
I think the object in my collection that would be the oldest object in the collection. That it was done a year before Star Wars came out, and it's a canvas banner that Charlie Lippincott had made up for the conventions in 1976, and it uses as art Ralph McQuarrie illustration of Starkiller, which was the early incarnation of Luke Skywalker, cut out from a cast and crew T-shirt that was made in 76 and sewed onto the canvas banner, which has blue stripes on the top and bottom, a black background, and the early Star Wars logo in yellow, which was hand-painted by Joe Johnston, who at that point was the art director of ILM and, of course, has gone on to become a famous director.
Yeah, it's a great piece. I remember it hanging at your place when I was there in April. Really cool. And yeah, I think the film of that, one of those conventions with it hanging in the background, is somewhere online. I remember it being released a few years back. Somebody found it. Chris G. Allen asks, were you ever involved in Bantha Tracks? That was before your time, right?
Bantha Tracks was before I joined Lucasfilm, but then we resumed Bantha Tracks as part of the Insider. And my number two at the time at Lucasfilm, Mary Franklin, took that over and was the editor of Bantha Tracks when it ran as part of the Insider.
Chris is an Indiana Jones fan, and he's also asked, were you ever involved in the short-lived UK Indiana Jones Adventure Fan Club in the early 90s after the Last Crusade premiered?
No, I never even heard of it.
No, me neither. Well, that's
there was a UK version of the Star Wars fan club early on. So I'm aware of that, and I've got some of the newsletters and the merchandise from that.
I think that's all of the questions, because I've probably asked all the other questions that people have asked. So as a final question then, Steve, what's the future of Rancho Obi-Wan? I think when I was there, at the end of the tour, we have an opportunity to meet you and have a photo and ask a question. The question I asked you was, have you ever considered, along with other big collectors like Gus Lopez and a few others, to kind of combine your collections into a larger museum? I don't know if you maybe want to answer that question again. Is there anything like that in the future on the horizon?
Gus and people who have some of the biggest or most impressive collections of Star Wars memorabilia in the world, Gus Lopez, Lisa Stevens and her husband Vic Wirtz, Duncan Jenkins, are all on our board of directors, and our board has been strategizing and trying to determine what the future of Rancho Obi-Wan is, whether it makes sense to combine collections, what will we do with them, where will we put them. So that's still under process right now. We're still considering it, but Rancho Obi-Wan, unlike in the early years when the internet was first starting and people would pose questions, is what happens to Steve's collection after he dies? And I told my then assistant Josh Ling he could post Well, Steve is going to be laid out in the middle of the collection, and it's going to be imploded around him. And a couple of people actually believe that. But Rancho Obi-Wan will live on, and the Star Wars memorabilia collection will live on.
Nice. I think that's a really nice way to end it. But maybe let's just give you a chance to sort of just remind people where they can find you on social media and the website and things.
So we've got active social media thanks to Consetta Parker. We're on Facebook, Instagram, X, Threads, TikTok, and RanchoObiwan.org has all of our information. As I said, it's a place where you can book your tours of Rancho Obi-Wan up to 6 months in advance. You can also become a member of Rancho Obi-Wan and sign up for our newsletter. We send out infrequent but important at the time updates as to what's happening at Rancho Obi-Wan, and we're about to announce something major in the near future. And so I hope people will sign up if you're interested and come join us on this amazing journey of almost 50 years in a couple of years.
Yeah.
So Star Wars, as Kenner once said, is truly forever.
Forever. I remember the ads. Thanks so much, Steve. A pleasure to talk to you. It's really nice to have a chat.
My pleasure, Jamie.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat with Steve Sansweet there. Thanks to Steve and to Consetta for organising that for us. By the way, Rancho Obi-Wan are having a big fundraiser taking place in Seattle on October 5th. You can find out all the details at ranchoobiwan.org/fundraiser 2024. Next up on the podcast, I have Academy Award-winning VFX supervisor Andrew Whitehurst. Andrew has worked on some great films, including Scott Pilgrim, Paddington, we love that one in the Benning household, Ex Machina, Spectre, Skyfall, the Bond movies, Annihilation, and most recently Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. I also have already in the bag interviews with the enigmatic Ty Ruben Ellingson, as well as VFX camera op Marianne Infield, and a bunch of others lined up in the coming months. I've also got some exciting news that I can't share just yet, but let me just say that I am very pleased. Keep listening and I'll let you know when I can. Paddy and I are still trying to get funding for our documentary, so if you know of any rich angels, angel investors that want to send us some money to help us finish our documentary, then get in touch. Oh, and a quick thank you to all of you who supported Peter Curran's Kickstarter to recreate the opening titles to John Carpenter's The Thing. Just yesterday morning, we got across the line. I say we, I mean I was just trying to help. I look forward to seeing what Peter does, because that short social media video I posted about him creating The Thing titles has now reached an incredible 2.2 million views and is still growing. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you can do so for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.